Everybody hears me? We're good? Okay, good. Okay, so I'm Nava, and this is a class which I called God's Name on Heathen Tongues. I'm not really sure what possessed me to call it that, but when I saw it a few weeks ago in Makori Shon, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, nobody will have any clue what I want to talk about. This could be anything. So I asked Melissa, and she kindly attached in biblical narrative. So now it's called God's Name on Heathen Tongues in biblical narrative, which is only a little bit less obtuse, but at least you know now that it's a Tanakh class. So yes, this is a Tanakh class. And from now on, we're going to change that name and we're going to call it something a little bit more sane. We're going to call it Foreigners Who Speak of God in Biblical Narrative. I'm going to elaborate pretty soon what Foreigners Who Speak of God means. I just want to say that this today is going to be an introduction class only. Hopefully by the end of this class, you will have some clue, or we will all have some clue, including me, about where this is going. But this is an introduction class, okay? So we're going to be speaking about foreigners who speak of God. I'm going to share screen. Hopefully I'm going to do that, and I will, hold on. Did that work? Yes, okay. All right. So this is Foreigners in Biblical Narrative Who Speak of God. My name is Nava Finkelman, and this is my email. I gave you my email because I'm not going to look at chats during the thing. So if you have a question, please unmute yourself and ask. I'm going to try to leave time for questions. I don't know if I'm going to get to chats. If there's anything that you don't want to say or ask or didn't have time in front of everybody, then please feel free to email me afterwards whenever you'd like. Okay. You know what? Okay. So why study biblical foreigners? Tanakh is a book that is written for Am Yisrael. And when we usually learn Tanakh, we look at the biblical heroes. We look at the Avot. We look at the Nevi'im. We look at all the Anshe Shlomeinu. We look at the people who we are supposed to learn from and emulate. And it seems a little bit odd, therefore, to spotlight foreigners and say, okay, let's study them. So I want to look at a few of the ways first in which scholars have looked at the topic of biblical foreigners. The first one, the most obvious, going back to our Mefarshim, is in the context of law. Foreigners could be a ger or nochri or a zar, or there are a few other minor designations, but these are the main ones. And there are many laws in Tanakh, Sefer Vayikra, Sefer Dvarim, and onward, which speak about how you're supposed to deal with these people. And so for people who want to learn those laws, it was important to study anything that had to do with ger, nochri, and zar, and how they are supposed to interact with us, what they're allowed to do, what they're supposed to do, what they're not allowed to do, how we're supposed to treat them, how we're supposed to act vis-a-vis them. That's one topic of how you could look at foreigners. A second topic, which came up way later, only not so long ago, 200 years ago, whatever, is the history angle. People who look at Tanakh not so much as a theological book or a Jewish book or a religious book, but more of yet one other document that we have that can help teach us about the past. So when archaeology started in these areas, in Israel and Egypt, Egyptology was a big thing, Mesopotamia, all that, and they found evidence of stuff, they tried to corroborate it with what they found in Tanakh and what they found in whatever other ancient writings they have. And it's really cool when you find, we're gonna talk about it, but when they found something called Ketovet Bil'am, where there's a whole wall of inscription about this magician named Bil'am, and that's really cool because then you have some sort of context where to put it. So people who study from the history angle in Tanakh, not archaeology, but in Tanakh with the help of archaeology and other sources, so look through Tanakh and figure out what were the Ammonim, what were the Moavim, how are they characterized in Tanakh, what do we learn about them from Tanakh? Where did they come from and what did they do, and what were the international relations back then? And maybe from our angle, what are the relationships with Israel from a historical point of view? People who care about ancient history use Tanakh among others as, because there are not that many sources, use Tanakh among others as one of the sources they can use to get information. We're going to be looking more at the, I think for us, conventional way to look at Tanakh, and that is to look at it as a book of theology. Book of theology means this is a book that was given to us by Kadosh Baruch Hu, and in it is a blueprint, so to speak, of how we are supposed to live our lives. So if you look at the law in Tanakh, okay, that's easy. It's going to get interpreted somehow through Mishnah, through Gemara, to technically how we're supposed to halachically live our lives. But if you look at the stories can give us more, like I said originally, more of an idea of, let's look at the Avot as our examples. Let's look at Yosef. Let's look at Esther. Let's look at all these people who are Shah or Nevi'im, listen to the words and learn from Tanakh how we're supposed to live, which is interesting because foreigners are not the people that we want to emulate. And indeed, most of the literature regarding theology of Tanakh comes from the Christian angle. And the Christians are very obsessed, I think, with the idea of Israel's election. There are those who are for and those who are against. Let me explain. Israel's election means that God chose Israel for whatever purpose, to do whatever, but God has clearly, according to the Tanakh, chosen Israel. Now, some will say that's a good thing, right? Because now we could be Or Lagoim, or now we can have our job in the world to continue it to do until, the New Testament people take over, and that's going to be their Acharei, some sort of that direction. Most Christian theologists look at election as some sort of racist, negative thing, right? Here the Jews claim that God chose them, and because God chose them, they think they're better than everybody else. And if they think they're better than everybody else, then they get to, rule everybody else or look down on everybody else. And there's a lot of discussion, nitpicking stories in Tanakh for things that prove that Israel's election is bad. Another aspect of theology, which has more specifically to do with foreigners, is if you look at the foreigners or the way foreigners are depicted in Tanakh, you can see how Israel has defined herself over and against these foreigners. I'll explain. If you have a group of, Mitzrim or Amalekim is a good example. If you have a group of Amalekim and you point out over and again why Amalek is a bad nation from a religious point, from a moral standpoint, let's say, and then you say, don't be like them, okay? So you use the Tanakh, in that case, would be using the foreigner as an example here. This is something to stay away from, right? So foreigners can serve in the function of self-defining Israel. What they are, we are not. You can look at it the flip side and say, well, some foreigners are good, and some foreigners are worthy of, let's learn Chokhmat HaGoyim, and let's learn this, that, and the other for foreigners. And that's also a way to define ourselves, to say, here, look, this is a good example. This is something that we want to learn from. Just one example about foreigners, if you put it a little bit in the context of when these things were written. If you look, for example, those of you who are familiar with the stories in Ezra Nehemiah, and all the prohibitions against taking foreign wives, okay, that is what a lot of scholars will call xenophobia, right? We don't want these foreign women. They're going to be a bad influence. You have to divorce these foreign women, stay away, because once you, and we see this, I think, in our times, once you start marrying foreign women and you become assimilated in their culture, okay, they may be assimilated in yours, but in the grand picture, give it a generation or two and they're the end of your nation, okay? So foreigners, no matter what aspect, you look at them as good or you look at them as bad, will have some sort of impact on, or some sort of say as to how Israel is going to be defined, okay? Good. I'm gonna go to the next, what's it called, slide. If anybody has any questions now, taking a 10-second break, 5-second break. 3, 2, 1. Lost your chance. Okay. theology and all the questions that we talked about before, the questions of election, the questions of self-definition, the questions of the good foreigner or the bad foreigner, in order to understand these things, you have to understand the text itself, okay? Because, for example, if I was looking at, I said law, you don't have to understand the fancy parts of the story or what, you just have to understand what it says. It says, do this, do that. Ger can do this, the Nochri can't do that, and there you have it. If you look at the history, the historians don't really trust the Tanakh, but it gives some sort of sounding board. Oh, this is, these are the Edomim and these are Moavim. If you want to talk about the messages, the theological message that come out of the story, you really have to understand the story. Here's one definition of literary analysis that I found, which I think works. If you look at Tanakh or any text, but in our context, Tanakh, as a piece of literature, and I'm gonna get back to that in a slide or two. That's not to say that this is not a holy text and this was not given by Kadosh Baruch Hu, but right now, if we want to understand it, we're approaching it as a piece of literature because that's the format that we got it in. And if we look at the text as literature, we need to analyze the idea that's in the story, especially if we're talking about a narrative. The plot, where is it coming from? Where is it going to? What's the problem? What's the resolution? Who are the characters? The tone, the writing style, everything that we can, all the information as if we're studying a literary text to get all the clues that the author, and I'm going to get to author in a minute too, writes in order to narrate the story, which means all the fancy literary devices that you are aware of, things like alliterations, the first letters and sounds and how the words fit together, allusions. Sometimes it's a pasuk or a word will send you to another text by association, and then one will have implications for the other. Chiasmus, right? When you have a B, C, B, A kind of structure, then you have a beginning and the end, and you can match and you can see all these things help us understand what it is that is what the message is in the text that we're looking at. Okay. One of the things among that whole list that we had before of alliterations, allusions, all those things, one of the things is repetitions. And this is going to be very important for our particular angle, and I'll explain. Repetitions happen often in Tanakh. Robert Alter gives us 5 different levels at which these repetitions can occur. The most common one, the most easy one, the smallest one is the late word, what's called a milah mancha. When you have the same word that appears very often 7 times, sometimes 5 times, sometimes 10 times in a short paragraph, that somehow conveys the message of this is important. Okay, this is what you're looking for. For example, if you look at the Bria, which we had this week, if you count how many times it says tov, right? Or how many times it says, as opposed to how many times it says vayivra or vayitzer. If you look at words that repeat themselves, you tend to see patterns, and these are the things that stand out. We take this for granted because we're all Tanakh students and we all know that this happens. We shouldn't take it for granted because if you look at modern texts, modern literature, okay, or whatever book you pick up, authors today don't do that. Authors today try to avoid using the same expression or using the same word a few times in a sentence or a few times in a paragraph because it sounds boring, it sounds repetitious, it sounds like they don't have enough of a vocabulary to come up with all the synonyms, right? And so they'll vary, and which is good, I guess, if you're reading modern literature. But in Tanakh, I'm bringing this up as a point because this is an English class in English, and many of you will be using, I think, an English Tanakh or a Tanakh with some sort of translation, which is fine. I just want to point out one of the pitfalls of using a translation. And here's an example that I like to use. This is where you guys unmute yourselves a little bit so I can see, so you can participate. When Moshe is born and he's 3 months old and his mother wants to hide him, right? Now you unmute yourselves and you tell me, please, how she saves baby. How does she hide him? Who is willing to be the first person to unmute themselves and tell me how she hides him?
In a basket.
She puts him in a basket.
Thank you.
Tar.
Perfect. 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 Rachel and Paula, thank you. You gave me exactly the answer that I was hoping for. She puts him with a basket and tar, right? And this basket becomes waterproofed with the tar, and she puts him there, and that he's saved. Excellent. Okay. Now, when God wants to save Noah from the flood, how does he save Noah from the flood? Go on.
Same word.
He puts him in an ark. But the word is teva, the same
there
word.
You go.
Right?
Okay. So if you're reading the English translation, then Moshe is in a basket and Noah is in a teva, in an ark, right? That's great. And then you'll have absolutely no reason to connect between the two. But if you pay attention to the Hebrew and Tanakh, which does not shy away from using the same word where it's relevant, you'll see that both of them are the teva. Noah was in a teva and Moshe was in a teva. And once you have the Hebrew, that just the technical use of the same word, and certainly in the same situation, right? Somebody who is going to be the future beginning of something after something is saved by putting in a waterproofed craft. Okay, you get the idea. All right, that's just my short warning against using English translations only. Okay, so use both. A second way that things could be repeated in the stories is motif. When you learn stories like, an easy example is the Yosef stories, right? There are several motifs that follow Yosef throughout all the stories from Perek Lamed Zayin, even including Yehuda and Tamar until the end of Bereshit. Anybody want to hazard a guess at what some of those motifs could be? No. Okay. How about Bor, right? He gets thrown into the pit, which is a bore, and when he gets thrown into the pit, and when he gets put into prison, he actually says, "What did I do? Shesamu oti babor hazeh," right? He gets thrown into the pit again. There's the motif of beged. His beged is taken off, torn from him, right? When he gets put into the bor, a beged is shown by Tamar to Yehuda. A beged is shown to Yaakov. He is taken off his begadim when he throws into the second pit. He changes his begadim when he goes to Paro, right? He gets new begadim after he comes to Paro. The beged is a motif there. What else? Dreams, right? Certainly dreams are a motif in the Yosef story. There's his dreams, two of them. There's the Sar Mashkim and the Sar Ofim, two of them. There's the Paro dreams, two of them. Dreams come out, okay? Or if you look at farther away in the Shimshon story, fire is a motif, okay? So when you have a motif and it brings you back and back, that's a good way to compare and say, okay, how does the plot change from one use of this motif to the next? Theme we're gonna skip for a moment because theme is our main theme, and so I'm gonna get to it on the next slide. Sequence of action is another way that Tanakh can repeat things that can repeat themselves in a biblical narrative. But by sequence of action, I mean something that, for example, 3 + 1. That's a very, very common sequence of action. We all know it from folk tales, from fairy tales, right? There's always 1, 2, 3, and then the next, right? Or in folk tales, it's usually 3. There's 2 and 1, right? There's the 3 brothers, and the youngest is always the smartest. There's the 3 whatevers, and the youngest and the last is going to be the successful. In Tanakh, we often have 3 + 1, where 1, 2, 3 becomes intensified, and then 4, something new happens or breaks the mold.
Like Bilam.
Bilam is an excellent example. Okay, Eov is another example. Right, we have the friend, and at the end we have the one who is not clear if he's a friend or a malach or what he is. Okay, so that's another one. The last one I want to talk about briefly now is the type scene. Many of you may have heard of type scene. A type scene is when you take motifs, we were talking about before, motifs like beged or bor or dreams or whatever, and you take a bunch of these motifs and you organize them, or the narrator organizes them in a particular sequence, right? You know that once it happens, B is going to happen, and then C is going to happen, and then D is going to happen, and you have this schema in your head. The most common one we're going to get back to one of our classes later on is, for example, the betrothal scene. there's the man who comes from afar. He meets a woman by a well, and well, there's a problem with the water, and the man helps the woman obtain some water, and then the woman brings the man back to her father's house, and then there's a meal, and then there's an engagement. Okay, that is a fixed sequence. Anybody want to bring up examples of where that comes up? This
With
is an easy
Rivka,
one.
it's kind of reverse.
With Rivka,
She doesn't get, yeah.
I'll get
'cause
to the
she
reverse in a
helps.
minute. I'll get to the reverse in a minute, right? We have the elements. Okay, I'll get to the reverse part in a minute. Anybody except for Rivka?
Yeah.
Yaakov and Rachel.
Yaakov and Rachel. Someone said Moshe and Tzipora, right?
No, Rachel and Tzipora. Rachel.
Right,
Rachel
Yaakov
is
and Rachel, right?
Tzipora.
And Tzipora with Moshe, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Okay, and there's one or two others, okay? But those are the most obvious ones. As Paula said, Paula, you can come back if you'd like. But as Paula said, as Paula said, the one with Rivka is a little bit different, right? In what way is it a little bit different? Because in her case, she was the one who gave the water, right? Okay. And in Moshe's case, it may be a little bit different because even though he married Tzipora, it says Vayol Moshe lashevet et ha'ish. It's as if he was marrying Yitro. And in Yitzchak's case, it's different because he didn't actually go to the well. It was Abraham's Eved who went to the well. Okay, so you have the story. You can leave now, Paul. You have the story, and you have the fixed sequence, which leads you to an expectation of this is what's going to happen next. And then each story has a very slight variation. And if you could pay attention to the variation, you can only pay attention to the variation if you know what to expect. But once you know what to expect, because you know there's this thing that's supposed to happen, and then something is different, then you can say, okay, well, what do I learn from the fact that it's different? Why is this story different from all of the stories, right? Why is it important in the Rivka story that she's the one that brings the water and not Yaakov and not Yitzchak or the Eved? Why is it important in the Moshe story to stress that he had this relationship with Yitro and not necessarily the relationship with Tzipora? Okay, so we're not looking at those now, but my point is that once you have an expectation of how a story is supposed to work, because it gets repeated several times, if you can point out the part in which it deviates from what you would expect, then you can learn something, I think, deeper about that story. Questions? No questions. Very clear. Okay. Good. So now I promised you that we're going to go back to the issue of theme, right? Which I skipped right here in the middle. Okay. Let me first define theme. Or rather, let me let Robert Alter define theme. A theme is an idea which is a part of the value system of the narrative. It may be moral, psychological, legal, political, philosophical, theological, made evident in some recurring pattern. Okay, now let's say that again in English. A theme is something, let's go to the end, made evident in some recurring pattern. So similar to like what we said before, but before we said a type scene is a whole story, right? You have a whole sequence of events. So a theme is not a whole sequence of events. It's some sort of idea. It's some sort of idea which when it comes up, it's a way of the author expressing some sort of idea, a theological idea, a historical idea, a political idea, a moral idea, but it happens again and again. This idea pops up in many different places, maybe with different forms, okay? But it's all expressing the same idea. We talked before about theology, and I made this claim and I opened it to questions and nobody challenged me, which is kind of nice. But I want to get back to that claim, and maybe now somebody's going to challenge me on that one. I made the claim that we could look at Tanakh and assume that it is written as a message from the author, in our case, Kadosh Baruch Hu, if we're talking about Chumash, to us, or if we're talking about the Nevi'im, from the Nevi'im to us, right? It's a message. And it is our job to uncover that message, right? And I claim that if we look at Tanakh through the tools of literary analysis and use all the tools that we have in our toolbox to look at all the different ways that the author said, didn't say, used, didn't use, whatever whatever elements, then we can understand the message. Okay, so disclaimer, which I'm making now and might make again throughout the year, we may be wrong, right? We may be doing everything right. We may be learning and finding all the allusions and all the repetitions and all the anomalies and say, hey, that refers to that pasuk and that reminds me of that pasuk. We can easily be wrong, okay? But we may be right. If you look at any if ever you look at up a pasuk, because you have a difficulty in the pasuk, right? I'm sure it happened to some of you sometimes, that you were wondering, hey, what does that mean in a pasuk? Or why does this make sense? And you opened your Mikrot Gdolot or your Makor Chaim or whatever it is, and you read Rashi, or you read Rashbam or Ibn Ezra, or whoever is your go-to Mefarish that you like, and you read what they say, and you're like, not convinced. And then you read another one, and you're like, and then you read a third one, and you say, well, that's totally, I don't understand that. And then you read a fourth, and you say, that's exactly, that makes sense. Okay, that's good, right? We go Mefarish shopping. Am I wrong? Right, okay. We all go Mefarish shopping, right? Because it may be blasphemy to say this, but none of the Mefarshim had the right answer either. Or rather, they may have reached the right conclusions, right? Because they knew how to study well and they knew a heck of a lot. And so they may have reached the right conclusions, but some of them may have reached the right conclusion that doesn't sit well with us. Shivim Panim LaTorah, they may have had their take on the text, and that may not be something that resonates with us as that makes sense to me. And so we'll move on to a different Mefarish whose take on it may be more similar to ours, and then we're going to say, that's a good Perush, because that's something that, that's something I would have said had I thought of it, right? So in this, when we look at our text, when we're going to be looking at our text through the years, through the year, we're not going to be using any Mefarshim. We're going to be our own Mefarshim. When we have a question or a problem that comes up the text, we are going to be doing the Perush. I'm not opening any Mefarshim. Now, if any of you want to be good students and studious and look up later whatever it is that, or while we're doing class, if you're bored, look up whatever it is that we're looking at and find shop for the Mefarish that says it, then wow, look, we said what Rashi said, or we said what Sforno said, and then we're going to feel really great because we must be right because here somebody said that. It could be they didn't say that because we're wrong. It could be they didn't say that because they are looking at different questions than what we are looking at, in which case we're going to be groundbreakers and we're going to come up with our new stuff, okay? But the reason I brought up all this is to say that we have, I think, just as much legitimacy to come up with a perush for whatever it is that is bothering us as anybody did before us. We may and the same tools and the same knowledge, certainly not the same knowledge, and the same ability to come up with what they're coming up with. Okay, so our perush may not be as theirs. Great, but thank you. But we are going to be tackling the text as we have it. Okay, good. All right, now I'm going to come up with a place that if we pass this next slide and you haven't yet turned off your Zoom, I'm going to feel very gratified because this is where I turn into a heretic. Okay, we're going to be talking about author now for a while. And here's what I want to say about author. We are all good from Jews. And as far as we're concerned, Kadosh Baruch Hu wrote the Chumash, Chamisha Chumshei Torah. Sefer Dvarim was written by Moshe Rabbeinu with the inspiration of Kadosh Baruch Hu, except for the last 8 psukim, which may have been written by Moshe, may have been written by Yoshua. All the rest of the books of Nevi'im were written by the Nevi'im of their name or other names. And Ketuvim were written by Anshe Knesset Agdola. That's great, okay? Despite owning up to that, I'm going to consistently refer to what I'm going to call the author or the narrator. And I'll tell you why. When we tell a story, and we're going to be looking only at the story parts of Tanakh, so I'm going to ignore all the legal texts and all the poetry and all the nevuah, which is a lot, and genealogies. I'm gonna ignore all that, and we're focusing right now just on the narrative, which is stories. Okay, when you tell a story, you're going to not tell the story as it was, because there's no way to tell the story as it was. Okay. You tell the story, first of all, you have to decide where to start. and you have to decide where to end, and you have to decide what point of view you're telling the story from. You're going to have to decide what you're focusing on. For example, if I said person A said hi to person B, that's a totally different story from person B heard person A say hi to him, right? Because they happened at the same time. They're both true, but they're different points of view. And it's going to come up with a different story. Now, while person A is saying hi to person B, a car just drove by, but I didn't even mention that because I considered it not important. Now, if person B had a serious learning disability or ADHD, right, and he didn't answer person A because he was busy listening to the car, then it's very important for the story because person A is going to be really upset. How come you didn't respond back? And it's like, I didn't even hear you, right? But I, as a storyteller, I'm just looking at the scene. I'm saying he said hi, and I'm going to ignore the fact that there was a car, okay? So what I'm trying to say is when you tell a story, there's no way to tell it objectively. You can get more objective. It's less objective. Like say person A said in a very happy, cheerful tone, hi, and person B very rudely ignored him. Okay, that's subjective. But as you saw, even the objective is not objective. So when we read a story from any story from Tanakh, while it is true, okay, there are different kinds of truths. First of all, it's going to be omitting a lot of stuff. Vayakom Kain el Vayomer el Kevel Achi, Vayakom Kain ve'argeu, however the pasuk, right? He gets up, he says, and he kills him. What does he say? We don't know. Did he say something? Presumably because it said Vayomer el Hevel Achiv. So we can try to fill in, Mefarshim fill in, okay? Because it's hard to leave a lacuna like that, right? What did Cain say to Hevel that made him kill him? Right? So Mefarshim are going to say they talked about politics, they talked about religion, they talked about women, they talked about whatever, which is the Mefarshim's way of saying two things. First of all, these are the kinds of things that one person would kill another person for. And second of all, they're saying, since the text didn't tell us, in this case, it doesn't matter what they were fighting about. Right? Okay, so a lot of times we're going to have omissions because maybe it's not important for us to know that information. Move on. So if you read a story, if you read Tolstoy, he's going to tell you the third name of the second cousin of everybody's neighbor, right? And they'll never use that name again, and who cares? I like to respect our Tanakh and say that every word that we have is for a reason. If we're not told something, it's for a reason, okay? But we have to appreciate the fact that we may not have all the information. That's one thing. Okay, everybody with me so far? Just nobody left yet. Great. Okay. Second thing is, especially if we're saying that Tanakh is a book of theology more than a book of history, my angle is that the author, now I feel comfortable to say author, the author of Tanakh uses historical events in order to bring forth their agenda, because as humans, we are more likely to connect with us, meaning if it comes through story form. Okay, that's been proved many times. If I say don't do A, do B, don't do A, whatever, that's far less meaningful than if I tell you a story, once upon a time somebody did this and this is what happened. Okay, so stories are meaningful for us. And so Tanakh uses a lot of stories to teach us the messages, but it comes with an agenda, right? Which means that, previous line, the focus of the story and the omissions and the extra parts and the speaking parts and all the different elements that go into choosing how a story is formulated will all be geared toward forwarding that particular agenda, right? To make it easier for us to understand the agenda, but that kind of perhaps moves it a little bit farther from what we can call historical objective truth. And here is an example that you are all familiar with because you all went to shul or street this week. If you look at the first two prakim of Breshit, right? Breshit Aleph is all the days, right? Vayomer Elohim, Vahi whatever, Vayarlim Kitov. Good. The second parak, Ela Toldot HaShamayim Ba'aretz B'hi Baram, tells a totally different story. Okay, right? We all know this. One of many differences, many contradictions. In Parak Aleph, I'll just use one example. In Parak Aleph, man and woman were created together. In Perek Bet, man was created after which woman was created. Correct? They can't both be true. So you can't look at it and say, well, one of them is lying. So there are many ways to solve this problem. If you look at, again, if we go back to secular scholarship, very obviously they're going to say, well, two different sources, right? There's the source J and the source E, and somebody wrote this perek and somebody wrote that perek, and they put it together, and so there are contradictions. What can you do? That's one way of looking at it. A second way of looking at it, which is, Rav Breuer's school of looking at it, is saying, well, maybe there are two different ways of looking at Bria. Like we're saying, right? Perek Aleph is from the perspective of Kadosh Baruch Hu, or is the ideal way, and everything is organized, and that's one way of looking at it. And Perek Bet is from man's point of view, or the less ideal, right? You could solve some, you could do it in some way, deal with it. As far as I'm concerned, for this class, it doesn't matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is because, let's say there were two sources, okay? Let's say Perek Aleph and Perek Bet were not written by Kadosh Baruch Hu, they were written by J and by E, and they were redacted by R or whatever, okay? I can assume, or I think I can assume that R was not an idiot. And if we see that there's differences and contradictions, whoever compiled the Tanakh as we have it today, with Perek Bet following right after Perek Aleph without any busha, and all the other repetitions, contradictions, all the other stuff, right? And put it together as the book that we have today, there must have been some reason for putting it together that way. So if you want to take that route and say, okay, it's a redactor, then at least respect the redactor and say, after all these millennia, there's a reason why this book stayed and is studied the way it is. If you want to take the other route and say, Kadosh Baruch Hu planted dinosaur bones so that we're going to uncover them and find and assume they were, whatever you want to say, it doesn't matter. We are going to respect this text, which I think is certainly worthy of our respect. And we're going to study it as it is. No tomatoes? No eggs. Great. Okay. So let me just give you, I love this example. I got this example from Josh Berman, Rabbi Professor Josh Berman, who got it, quoted somebody else for supplying this example. One second. Now I actually want to see some people. I don't know how to do that on this grid, but I'll try. Okay. Hello, people. All right. This is where you're going to unmute yourselves. I have here a few sources from Divrei Yamim. Each one deals with the military strength of different king. We're totally talking out of context, has nothing to do with anything. I am bringing this slide here just as an example of poetic license, okay? A small example of what I call poetic license, which means using generally what happened in history, but distorting the technical facts as they are in order to convey a certain message. You with me? Yes? Yes, okay. All right, so here's the first one. I'm going to translate, because this is in English, I'm going to translate everything that we're going to be reading during this class. My translation is a very, very loose translation. If I'm going too fast, let me know. If you want to look along in your Tanakh, that's fine. But everything we're going to have in this class is going to be on screen in any case. All right. In Divrei Yamim, we hear like this. Vayavo Rechavam Yerushalayim, Rechavam was Shlomo's son. He came to Yerushalayim, Vayakhel et Bet Yehuda uBinyamin, and he gathered the houses of Yehuda uBinyamin. 180,000 bachur oseh milchama. How many people is that? How many soldiers is that? Give me the number.
180,000.
180,000. Well done. Okay. And he got these people together in order to lilachem im Yisrael, to fight the northern kingdom, lashivet mamlacha leRechavam, because Rechavam's kingdom was split, right? So he took his forces in order to fight against the northern kingdom. 180,000. That's our starting number. Now we get a lot of numbers in Tanakh. We get a lot of big numbers. We get a lot of small numbers. Many times the numbers are right. When we say, for example, that Shishim Ribo, 600,000 people left Egypt, right? Did that include the baby that was born the night before and the 2 people that died? Okay, you're saying no, Leah. Go ahead. Unmute yourself. I can't hear you. Leah.
It excludes the baby.
From what I understand, the 600,000 was just the men over 20, and everybody.
Okay, were there exactly 600,000 people over men over 20?
550. That's a number I remember.
Okay.
Is it supposed to be more of an estimation?
But I'm asking for a reason. All right, so in some cases it could be estimation, right? They didn't count every last man. That was a general, like today, you know, when they want to give you on the news at the end of the year how many people live in Israel, they're going to give it to the last person, or how many people were lahavdil killed in all our wars or in our car accidents. They're going to give you an exact person, right? But when they tell you how many people were killed in the First World War, I don't think anybody's going to give you a number to the last digit. The last 3 digits are going to be zeros, right? It just means around this. Sometimes numbers are given to just tell us it was a really big number, right? If they say 400, or they say 1,000, or they say 10,000, sometimes it just means a really big number, maybe in that scale. Okay, but let's go back to our example, and I want to show you a third way to use numbers, which is, I think, really a good example of agenda-based. Let's look at the second example. V'yasor Aviyah, one of the next, the Rehavam's son, the next king of Judea. V'yasor Aviyah tamilchama b'chayil giborei milchama. Okay, so Aviyah started this war with how many people? 400,000 ish bachor. How many people do we have here?
400,000.
400,000. Great. Okay, let's move on. What do we know between 100,000 and 180,000? Well, besides the fact that they're both round, beautiful numbers, I think one of the things we could see is that 400,000 is more than twice 180,000, right? Which is a nice way of, you'll believe me later, you're not going to believe me now, but a nice way of saying, wow, Aviyah was more than twice as strong as Rehavam. If these are not real numbers, okay? If these are real numbers and these are real numbers, I can't argue with that. But if they're not, this may say something like that. You know, as Rehavam, as great as Rehavam's army was, his son was more than twice as much. Great. Let's move on to the next son. Vayhi la'asa chayil noset sina v'romach miyuda. Asa, the king Asa, had an army of archers from Yehuda, 300,000. Okay, so he had from Judea 300,000. I put those together. From Binyamin, which is the other shevet that goes together with Yehuda, he had noseim again, shields, dorchei keshet, and archers. 280,000 kol ele giborei chayil. He had 280,000 from Binyamin. He had 300,000 from Yehuda. Okay, those are the numbers that grandson Asa had. Can anybody see something very interesting about the numbers that we have on the board right now?
Yes.
Go on.
The numbers together of the last 2 numbers are added up are the same as the first 2 numbers added.
You're not even on my screen. I don't know who's talking.
My name is Donna. I think here now. I'll be on your screen.
Oh, now you're on my screen. Hi, Donna. Great. Okay, exactly. Okay, so kudos to Donna who noticed this. I'm
a mathematician. That's what happened.
Oh, there you go. Okay, so for those of you who are not mathematicians, if there are any non-mathematicians in our crowd today, okay, pay attention to the fact that the 2 numbers that we saw here, this, okay, are exactly equal to the sum of the 2 numbers saw here, right? They're both together 58,000. Okay, so again, it could be that these numbers are exactly the numbers down to the last person of how much Asa had, how many Asa had, or it could be the author's way of saying, look, he had as much as the previous 2 kings put together, right? Let's go to the last line, okay? The last one is Yehoshaphat. Yehoshaphat is known as one of the best kings of Yehuda after David HaMelech. Vayhi Yehoshaphat holech v'gadel. He became a great, powerful king. Va'anshei milchama giborei chayil b'Yerushalayim. He had a lot of soldiers in Yerushalayim. Ve'ele pkudatam, and here are their numbers, okay? And it breaks it up into 4 battalions or whatever. Adna Hasar, okay, which is some sort of Ramatkal, okay, chief of staff. Ve'imo giborei chayil 300,000. So we have 300,000 with Adna Hasar. Ve'al yado Yochanan Hasar, the next general. Ve'imo 280,000, 280,000. Ve'al yado Amasya ben Zichri, Hamitnadev LaHashem. Okay, he gets a special appellation. He's some sort of volunteer, this Amasya person. And he has with him 200,000, 200,000 warriors. And of course, we can't forget the Binyamin. Binyamin Gibor Chayil El Yada. And Binyamin are known for being archers. Imo Noshke Keshet, they have their bows and arrows and shields. 200,000, 200,000. Va'al Yado Yehozavad, whoever that is, the next person. Ve'imo 180,000 chalutzei tzava. And he has with him 180,000. Donna, you want to do a quick summary for us?
So it's the same amount. Top and bottom.
Well, it's easier if we like, you don't actually, if you cheat, right? So these two numbers, right? 300,000, 280,000 are the same as these, right? And these two numbers, 200,000, 200,000 are the same as this. And the 180,000 is the same as this, okay? So you're saying that King Yehoshaphat, who is one of the greatest kings of them all, right? He has as much as all the previous ones put together. Okay, you with me on this? What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that it could be that whoever wrote this in Divrei Yamim had accurate lists of all the soldiers who were in all these armies, and they counted them, and they just happened to all be nice round numbers to the 100,000. It could be that they weren't nice round numbers, but he gave an estimate, right? So if it was 198,000, they'll say 200 because it's close enough. But I think this example is very clear, right? I hope that I've convinced you. This is a totally agenda-based list. It may be close to the real numbers. I have no way of knowing that. I don't even know if the person who wrote it had any way of knowing that, but let's say it's close, okay? But the way it's laid out, the numbers that are so carefully given to us in this format, I think scream, I'm trying to send you a message, right? And the message I'm trying to tell you is something about how to look at the relative military greatness of these kings, one relative to another. Now, these are not stories. These are whatever. We're not going to get into these stories. I'm bringing this because I'm going to beg for your patience when I'm going to use this sort of thing for everything that we're going to read. Because everything we're going to read, I'm going to claim is there for a reason. And it's there for a reason, even if it may be a distortion of what actually happened. Because whoever it was that was writing the story, and I'm not calling Kadosh Baruch Hu, I'm going to call it the author, because Kadosh Baruch Hu is ultimate truth, objective. I have nothing to say to that. But when things got put into writing, as far as we're concerned, they're the author because they have an agenda and they have a way of presenting so that we can understand and so that we can learn and so that we can get out of it whatever it is that we want to get out of it, right? And so we're going to look at all the stories that we're going to look at, keep in the back of our mind that it was written from, the source of Nevuah or Kadosh Baruch Hu, whatever, but treat it as if not historical fact, but however it is presented, it is there for a reason and it's going to teach us something. Nobody left. I am very impressed. Okay. Any questions before we move on?
I have a question.
Yes, please. Hold on a second. Oh, wait. Let me see if I can. I hate this.
Wait, I have to.
I want to see if I could stop share so I could see you for a second.
Right.
Yes.
I don't quite understand the difference between author and Hashem.
Okay, good. Thank you for asking that. Okay, I'm taking as for granted because I'm coming from the firm world, but you don't have to come from my standpoint. That Kadosh Baruch Hu wrote Chumash, and Nevi'im wrote Sifrei Nevi'im, okay? But for my purposes, if I say Kadosh Baruch Hu, this didn't happen, but Kadosh Baruch Hu wrote it this way because I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not comfortable saying that Kadosh Baruch Hu changed the like nuanced it, gave it a spin, okay, in order for us to get him. I'm not comfortable with that. I'm happier knowing that he authorized, let's say, the version that we have today, and in it, Kadosh Baruch Hu, or the author, appears as an author, like any other author who's trying to give over his message in as clear and well, sometimes not clear, but in as precise, let's say, in as precise a way as possible. And it is our job to learn what this author, or what the formulator of these stories is trying to tell us. Is that clear, or did that make it worse?
Not quite. I mean, how is it different than what do we call them? Exegesis is whatever it is. How is it different from divine inspiration, which is me? I'm just very confused. Yeah.
Okay.
Can we possibly say?
Yeah.
I don't know, that Hashem, obviously we're from people, we know Hashem wrote the Torah, but can we say that it's written in this style for us to glean things from, because it's not written for God. God wrote it for us within the limits of our human brain to understand. So he wrote it with these hidden things. We're still saying he wrote it, but he wrote it to send.
Except we're going to call it author because it's in God's role as author.
Wait, what?
He's taking on the role of an author in order to formulate it in a way that we can understand.
That's exactly what I'm saying, because we can only stand.
Exactly.
Right, okay. I'm okay with that.
Eileen, does that help?
I always thought that, say, it was human exegesis, a human writer, wouldn't he see the contradictions but
no, but I think the contradictions are there on purpose.
Exactly.
The contradictions are there on purpose because we learn from those contradictions, of course. But I'm just going to call Kadosh Baruch Hu in his capacity as giving us the Torah, God, an author, because that is how we're going to perceive the text. Is that fair?
Yeah. May I say that sometimes we refer to the Torah anthropomorphically as she is saying, she says, meaning the Torah is speaking.
Okay, you could do that. I'm more comfortable by saying author just because it sounds more natural to me, but it's the same idea.
I accept that we're going to say author. That's fine. About me.
Okay. Yeah. So anybody who has a problem with author, just translate it to yourself, to Kadosh Baruch Hu, or to the Torah, or whatever you'd like. Okay. So it all means the same. It's just, I think it's, in this case, semantics.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Let's go back. Here. Okay. So now that okay, well, hold on a second.
Can I just ask a question about the numbers?
Yes. Yes.
Can you go back to that slide? Okay, the bottom paragraph, all these people together, they're whatever, 1,160,000.
Which is also not believable because they didn't have that many people, soldiers relative to the population. But yes, go on.
True. But now these all were part of Yehoshaphat's army, just different sarim in Yehoshaphat's army. Is that what it's supposed to be?
That's what it said.
Different generals.
Yes, he had different generals, different battalions, just like today. You know, we have chila this and chila that and chila the other. And sometimes it's from this shevet and sometimes from that shevet. Here you have the archers and you have the runners and you have the whatever. They're just different parts of his army.
But okay, so I mean, what's clear is that Yehoshaphat had a whole lot more than your previous examples.
He had exactly as much as all the previous three examples put together.
Nachon. Okay, he had as much. Nachon. He had as much as all the three. No, three. You're right. All the three examples put together before.
Right.
But I mean, does it? Is there anything? Are we supposed to glean anything from the fact that, you know, his first two generals had 580,000, which was the same as the two guys in the example before, and the same as
maybe I don't know enough about these particular generals, but that would be a good way of looking at it. Like, why is the two the same number as the I don't know, but that that would be a way of looking at it. Yes, I don't, in this particular example, I don't know.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Let's move
thanks.
on. Okay, so we're back to our topic of foreigners who speak of God in biblical narrative. All right, good. Foreigners. What are foreigners? Could anybody help give me a definition of who I'm going to include in who we're looking for?
How about anyone who's not Jewish or Hebrew?
Great. How do you know who's not Jewish?
Anyone not in the lineage.
Anyone not in lineage. Okay. So for example, now I'm going to challenge you. Is Esav a foreigner?
It's the outsiders and the insiders, like within the way.
Ah, okay. So there's outsiders and insiders, right? What about Noach?
He preceded Abraham, so he's before the whole Jewish thing.
Good. So anybody after Abraham, anybody after Avram Avinu, who is part of the lineage, right? But did not get kicked out, right? Like Esav and Ishmael, right? What about people who married in? Are they considered part of the lineage?
It depends if.
What about Eved Avraham who went to find Rivka? Is he considered part of the lineage?
No, definitely no.
All right, so these are things that we're going to have to define, okay? But yes, in general, that's going to be our definition. People from Avram Avinu on who are part of the direct lineage. I will add on that they are considered by the text to be part of Am Yisrael. So for example, if I take Eved Avraham, I don't know who he is and where he came from, but I know that if he's considered, what's he called, something Beito, right? He's considered like the head of Avram's household. And we know that when Yitzchak had his brit, then also all of Avram's household became Meguyar. So I can assume that the text is kind of considering him in Israel. We don't call it Jewish because Jewish is a way later term. We're going to call it Israelite or Am Yisrael, right? Because Jewish comes from Judea, which is Shevet Yehuda, and people became Jews only when there weren't anybody else except for Shevet Yehuda, which is after the Churban and after Galut, Bavel. Right. Until then, we were all Am Yisrael and not Yehudim and not Jews.
But okay. what about people like Yaakov's concubines or whatever you want to call them, like Bilhah and Zilpah? I mean, they're not part of the lineage, but they were part of the household. So,
right. That's what I said. They married in, right?
They married in.
I think if you call them imahot, you can't really avoid calling them part of Am Yisrael, because there was no concept of giur in the Tanakh. There was no, you have to accept whatever mitzvot, and you had to do milah and you had to do tefillah. That's a way later concept. People became part of Am Yisrael because they joined Am Yisrael, and that was that. You married in, which is one of the reasons why taking foreign wives became a problem later on, because if there's no concept of giur, then what makes them quote Jewish, right? The husband could easily go after the wives. In the earlier times in Bereshit, they took Avram sends his Eved to get somebody from the mishpacha, right? So even though Lavan is we'll talk about this a lot, but even though Lavan is a pagan, his daughters were allowed in, and that's going to have justified. Thankfully, a lot of these questions, like Bilhah and Zilpah, who I think are less questions, but Esav and Yishmael and others, they don't actually speak about God. So we don't have to, we can kind of ignore them. It's become a moot question. But that's going to be our general definition of who these foreigners are. We're going to come to a list of them soon. Okay, when I say speak of God, let's go down to the next one because that's just easier. When a biblical narrative just means that we're talking about stories, okay? We're not talking about, like in law, when it talks about lo teta'ev edomi, I don't care about that because there's no Edomite in that pasuk who's actually doing something, okay? So we're only talking about the stories. When I say speak about God, I mean that we're only going to be looking at examples of direct speech. We're not going to be looking at at cases where the author or the text or the Torah tells us that a foreigner did or said something, unless they also actually speak. Okay, and when they speak, they're going to have to mention God. Now that's also tricky because, as we're going to see, you can mention God in several ways. The two main ways are obviously Yud Kei Vav Kei, right? Shem Havaya, and Elohim. And as we're going to see in many of our examples, Elohim is tricky because it may not always mean our God. Okay, Elohim is, we're going to see, is a kind of generic word for deity, and we're going to have to decide in each case what they're talking about. Okay. Now comes my okay. So let's go to a list of who we're going to be looking at. So in Sefer Bereshit, this is the part where you all unmute yourselves and you start throwing out anybody that you could think of in Sefer Bereshit who may qualify. We're talking about Goyim in Sefer Bereshit after Avram who speak of God.
Malki Tzedek.
Malki Tzedek, great. Next.
Paro.
Again?
Paro.
Paro, good. If you have a Tanakh, this is the time that you
Bilam.
Bilam is not in Bereshit. We're going to get to Bilam when we get to Bamidbar. Right. In Bereshit. We're not now just Bereshit. Avimelech.
Avimelech.
Avimelech, great.
Lavan.
Lavan. One more. She always gets forgotten. Hagar.
Hagar.
Okay. So these are the 5 people that we're going to be looking at in Bereshit. Okay. Shmot. Who do we have in Shmot?
Yitro.
Yitro, excellent. And the more obvious one?
Paro. Paro.
Paro. Okay. And we also have the Chartumim and Avdei Paro. They're all like little cameo appearances in the Shmot. Okay. Now everybody's favorite. Everybody's favorite is Bilam, and you can't ignore Balak was part of his story also. Okay. There's obviously nothing in Vayikra because the only 2 stories that we have in Vayikra are Nadav and Avihu and the Mekoshesh Etzim, and there's no other stories, and so there's nothing in Vayikra, and there's nothing in Devarim either because there are no real stories in Devarim. It's just, speech after speech. So that's what we have from Torah. Let's move on.
Excuse me?
Yes.
Where does Batya fit in this?
She doesn't speak of God. That's excellent. She would be a perfect foreigner, but she does not speak of God. But that would have been if she would have said something, she would have made it to our list. Okay, who's in Sefer Yeshua?
Wait,
Same
who
with
do you mean by Mitzrayim?
Same with Tzipporah. Unless you say she married Moshe, but that would be a tricky one because she went back to her own people. So whether or not she's considered a foreigner now for Tzipporah would be an excellent question. So I suppose we should be grateful that she didn't, because that would that takes off one more dilemma. Who's in Sefer Yeshua? Rachav.
I'm sorry. Her action with the Brit Milah is attending to the command of Hashem. So how do we
Correct.
get her out?
Correct.
Because she has no voice?
Maybe. I think because what I'm trying to get at, I'm going to get that soon, but what I'm trying to get at in all these stories we're going to see on the next slide is what is it that they're saying about God?
Mm-hmm.
So we may have some sort of a dilemma maybe with Tzipporah saying, well, she's making a statement by the fact that she's doing this Brit Milah. I don't know if it's a religious statement or if it's a saving her husband statement or whatever it is, but let's keep that as a question. Yoshua, we said Rachav and the Givonim. If anybody know, if not, you're going to learn about Givonim. Shoftim is tricky. There's no reason for you to know it. There's Adoni Bezek, and there's a Chayal in the Gidon story who talks about him. And the most obvious.
Delilah?
Huh?
Delilah?
She doesn't mention God. And after Sefer Shoftim, anybody venturing a guess?
What's her face? The wife that was really bad.
The who?
Eshet Ba'alat Ha'of.
Oh, well, I put Ruth first, just because it's Bibi Meshvat Shoftim, so of course Ruth also speaks about God. Okay?
Just in Sefer Shoftim now, or all of them?
That's it. These are the ones in Bereshit, Shemot, Bamidbar, Yoshua, Shoftim, Ruth. These are all the characters that we have. If anybody, wait, we didn't get to Nach yet. Okay, Eshet Ba'alat Ha'of is not either. Here are the other ones that we have in the rest of Tanakh. Okay, in Yonah we have obviously the Malachim, the sailors, and the Nineveh people. We have a bunch of people in Shmuel. We have a whole bunch of people in Melachim. I put Nebuzaradan in parentheses because we're going to talk about him in context of Melachim, but he's actually appears in Yirmiyahu. One example in Divrei Yamim, which is very interesting. 2 in Daniel, although Nebuchadnezzar has 3 stories, 3 separate stories, and a bunch of people in Sefer Ezra. Okay, this is the corpus of examples that we're going to be looking at throughout the year. Hopefully, I'm going to dedicate one class more or less to each of these people. So if you miss a class, you're just going to miss a person, but it's more or less going to work out hopefully to one class.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So Ruth, because she joins Am Yisrael, you're still keeping her on
now,
the list?
was that I can't say Melissa?
Yeah.
Okay, so the reason Melissa is asking me this question is because when I did this class last year, we did not include Ruth. Ruth is somebody who I've just recently become convinced that she should be part of this class. And Melissa, if you're not attending, I will let you know when the Ruth class is so you can hear the latest addition to this class. Okay, so yes, she's saying it when she is joining Am Yisrael as her like key to get into Am Yisrael, but there's still more. There's a bit more to it. Okay, all right. This is the arguably the most important slide in this class today. What are we looking for? When we're going to be looking at all these stories of all these foreigners, and as I said before, I'm treating them as a theme, which means I'm going to make the claim that foreigners are, I'm going to make the claim at the end of the year, that foreigners are used throughout the entire Tanakh, even though Tanakh was written over hundreds of years. Foreigners are put in their stories throughout Tanakh to serve a few purposes. There are a few theological purposes, which we're going to see come up again and again in the different stories. And we're going to be looking at each story and trying to figure out what angle, what they add to us. So here are the few of the questions that we're going to be looking at when we look at these stories. Okay, first of all, what are they saying? Okay, they could be, what are they saying? Something, if they're talking about God, right? Are they saying something positive about God? Are they saying something negative about God? Are they saying, if they're saying something positive, what aspect of positive are they saying? Why, right? By what name? FSG is short for foreigners who speak of God. By what name do they speak of God? Are they talking about Shem Havaya, or do they use Shem Elohim? And in what way does that change? Why is that important for the story? Why couldn't the author have used the other name? Why was that particular name? I think it's very important that one name is used and not the other. Okay, why is it important that whatever messages the author is trying to get through to us readers, why is it important to have the foreigner in the story verbalize the message and not the Israelite in the story or just the passive voice of the narrator? Now, again, we go back to our author issue. You can give me a very easy answer and say, well, because that's how it happened, right? The foreigner said that, and so the biblical author is recording it. Maybe. Or maybe the story as it happened had happened however it happened, but for us to understand the message, it is better to have whatever message put in the mouth of the foreigner, whether or not he said it, okay? Maybe he said it, maybe he didn't, but I think in many cases, the fact that the foreigner is the one who said it is important. So maybe history just happened out conveniently for our theological understanding, or maybe that's just how a better way of shaping the story. So somebody said this message, or whatever message comes out of the story will be made clearer to us if it was said, and if it was said by the foreigner, it has an extra benefit. Okay, in what way do these foreigners' words contribute to the flow of the story? Which means sometimes we have a story that if you took out the part of the foreigner, the story wouldn't change that much. If you look at Tanakh as a history book, you can have the next story just keep flowing without what they said. And sometimes what they say is a hinge for the rest of the story. Okay, so that's one way of understanding their contribution to the story. Sometimes, especially when you could just lift out that quote and ignore it, then maybe we can make the claim that what they're saying is aimed for us, the reader, and not for any of the characters within the story. We're going to get back more to that. I'm running short of time, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly now. In what type of situations do they use these foreigners? For example, do these come up in situations where there's conflict with Israel? Do they come up in situations where there's some sort of relationship that is trying to be built between foreigners and Israel. They come up in situations where there's some sort of relationship between foreigners and God, or Israel and God, or foreign, like what situations are we talking about? Okay, what types of foreigners make these statements? For example, high status, low status. We're going to see a lot of these foreigners are kings. Sometimes they're the bottom of the heap. Okay, here's a small anecdote for why what this means. In May, I think Shelley can correct me if I'm wrong, but in May 2017, President Donald J. Trump came to Israel. And it was widely covered by all our media people. And one of the things that was covered was the fact that Trump went to the Kotel. And Trump put a note in the Kotel. Okay, we don't know what that note says, or we do know what that note says. We don't know what he was thinking, certainly. We don't know what he believed or whatever when he came to the Kotel, but it was very important for all the media to tell us, Am Yisrael, that the great king of the Western world came and put a note at our Kotel. Now, I don't think anybody of the listeners to those news reports believe that Trump said, okay, so my religion is dumb and here's the true God. I don't think that's the message, right? But there's something about the fact that a foreign leader, even if he doesn't believe in your God, comes and pays respect to your holiest place. That is something that sends a strong message, and we're going to see what kind of message that sends. But that's if it was not Trump, if I don't know, your average Korean tourist came in and went to visit the Kotel, that would not be newsworthy. But if Trump does it, if the president of the United States does it, that's already newsworthy on a religious, national, whatever level, no matter what it is that Trump himself may have been thinking at the time. Sometimes we're going to see whatever these foreigners say, sometimes an individual foreigner will say it, and sometimes a whole group of people will say it, and that will also make a difference to our understanding. If we said about Trump, we don't really care whether or not he believed that our God is God. That the fact that he went to the Kotel was important nonetheless. But it's interesting to think what religious commitment does the Tanakh expect of these foreigners? In other words, if they continue to be pagans, are they considered good or bad? From a literary perspective, how do these foreigners' words characterize themselves? Or sometimes, let's say, if they're a good foreigner, right, a moral foreigner, whatever, sometimes they make the Israelites in their story look bad. And that's another message that we can learn. Sometimes they're said the words as the focus of the story. It all builds up to this big statement. And sometimes it's just there to carry the story on, and that will also make a difference to understanding. And the last one is, how does our understanding of the implied original reader? In other words, if we know that, yes, these stories are also aimed at us, they're aimed at all of Am Yisrael throughout the ages, but if we can try to figure out who the original audience are, sometimes, for example, people in the Galut or people just coming back, Shavei Tzion, it can give a whole different meaning to these stories. Okay, now I'm going to go really quickly because I think I have like 30 seconds left. So we're going to talk about, we've talked about who they are. We're going to talk about what they add to their each story within the microcosm of the story. How does their words help us understand the message of the story better? We're going to look, as we did before in that list. Each book has X foreigners in it, and I think they all together help bring out whatever message, the main message or one of the main messages of the book is, like what is Breshit trying to tell us, what is, I don't know, Yoshua trying to tell us. And at the end of the year, if we survive to the end of the year, we're going to see that there's some sort of consistent use throughout all the foreigners that we're going to see in the whole year, in the whole Tanakh, some consistent use in which all authors say, okay, this is a message that I want to get across, and I'm going to get across somehow by using a foreigner. Okay, I think that's the end of my class. I even went over a minute. So if you have any questions, I think email would probably be best, unless you have patience to stay out for an extra minute. I'm very happy to hear. If not, then whoever.
Thank you, Nava.